August 1944, somewhere in northern France. General George S. Patton's Third Army is tearing across France at a pace that's stunning both the Allies and the Germans. Town after town falls. German units are surrounded, destroyed, or forced to retreat in panic. Patton's tanks are moving so fast that some German commanders don't even know American forces are in their area until Sherman tanks roll into their headquarters. But Patton has a problem. A massive problem that threatens to stop his advance cold. His tanks are running out of fuel. His trucks are running out of gasoline. His artillery is running out of shells. The Third Army is consuming 400,000 gallons of fuel per day. More than 800,000 gallons on some days when operations are intense. And the nearest supply depots are back in Normandy, over 400 miles away, across bombed-out roads and destroyed bridges. German generals watching from their command posts begin to smile. They know what this means. They've studied American operations, and they've identified what they believe is a critical weakness. American logistics are impressive in theory, but vulnerable in practice. The Americans rely on massive supply lines. Cut those lines, or simply let them stretch too far, and the offensive will grind to a halt. The German assessment seems correct. Patton's advance is slowing. His tanks are literally running out of gas. Supreme Allied Commander Eisenhower is prioritizing supplies from Montgomery's advance in the north. The Third Army is getting the scraps. It looks like the German general's mockery of American logistics was justified. The Americans can't sustain their offensive. The war will drag on through winter. Then something happens that the German generals never expected. A massive convoy of trucks, thousands of them, begins operating around the clock, driving a continuous loop from Normandy to the front lines and back. These trucks, driving day and night, ignoring speed limits and safety regulations, hauling supplies at a pace never before attempted in military history. It's called the Red Ball Express, and it's about to prove that American logistics aren't just good, they're the best weapon the Allies have. Welcome back to the channel. Today we're covering one of World War II's most underappreciated achievements, the Red Ball Express, the massive truck convoy system that kept Patton's army moving and shocked German commanders who thought American supply lines were a weakness. Hit that subscribe button because this is the story of how 6,000 trucks and 23,000 drivers, 3/4 of them black Americans serving in segregated units, delivered 12,500 tons of supplies daily and changed the course of the war in Europe. German military planners had studied American operations carefully, and they'd reached some dismissive conclusions about how the United States fought wars. The German assessment went something like this. Americans were wealthy and had enormous industrial capacity, but they didn't understand modern warfare. They relied too heavily on material superiority rather than tactical brilliance. They needed vast amounts of supplies to operate: fuel, ammunition, food, spare parts. This dependence on logistics was, in German eyes, a fundamental weakness. German doctrine emphasized speed, maneuver, and living off the land when possible. The concept of blitzkrieg, lightning war, was built on rapid movement by armored columns that would penetrate enemy lines and keep moving, not waiting for supply columns to catch up. German units were expected to operate with minimal logistical support when necessary, capturing enemy supplies when available. The Germans looked at American forces and saw something very different. American units consumed supplies at rates that seemed absurd to German planners. American soldiers expected hot meals, regular mail delivery, access to medical care, and constant resupply. The average American division required something like 650 tons of supplies per day just to maintain operations. A German division might operate on half that amount or less. This wasn't entirely wrong. American forces did consume supplies at extraordinary rates. But what German planners failed to understand was that this wasn't a weakness, it was a feature, not a bug. American military doctrine recognized that the United States had enormous industrial capacity and could afford to use it. Rather than asking soldiers to make do with less, American planners asked, what do our troops need to fight effectively, and how do we get it to them? The answer was a logistics system designed from the ground up to deliver overwhelming material superiority to the front lines. But the Germans had a point about vulnerability. After the D-Day landings, American supply lines stretched from Normandy beaches to the rapidly advancing front. Those supply lines crossed terrain that had been fought over, with roads damaged by combat and bridges destroyed. And as the front moved farther from Normandy, those supply lines got longer and more tenuous. German intelligence reports in August 1944 noted this with satisfaction. The American advance was moving faster than their supply system could sustain. Soon, the reports predicted, American tanks would run out of fuel, American artillery would run out of shells, and the advance would stall. Then, German forces could counterattack against overextended American units that couldn't be resupplied or reinforced. It was a reasonable assessment based on how logistics had worked in previous wars. But it failed to account for American ingenuity, organization, and sheer determination embodied in a truck convoy system that would operate at a scale never before attempted in military history. By late August 1944, the logistics crisis was real and getting worse by the day. The Allied breakout from Normandy had been spectacularly successful. After weeks of brined-in combat in the hedgerows, American forces had finally broken through German defenses. Patton's Third Army was unleashed, racing across France. But this success created a problem that Allied planners hadn't fully anticipated. They were moving too fast. The original invasion plan assumed that Allied forces would advance methodically, capturing ports along the way to provide supply points. But the rapid breakout meant that the front lines were now hundreds of miles from the Normandy beaches, the only major supply point available. The port facilities at Cherbourg had been captured but were badly damaged by retreating Germans. Other ports along the French coast were either still in German hands or their facilities had been demolished. The great port of Antwerp in Belgium would be captured intact in September, but the approaches were still controlled by Germans, making it unusable. So nearly everything, every gallon of fuel, every artillery shell, every ration, every spare part had to come across the Normandy beaches or through the limited facilities at Cherbourg, then be transported hundreds of miles to the front lines. The system that was supposed to handle this was called the Red Ball Express route, designated roads that supply trucks would use to move material forward. But it was breaking down. There weren't enough trucks, the distances were too great, drivers were exhausted, vehicles were breaking down from constant use. Patton's Third Army was particularly affected. Eisenhower had made a strategic decision to prioritize supplies for Montgomery's 21st Army Group advancing toward Belgium and Holland. This made sense strategically. Montgomery's advance threatened the Ruhr industrial region and V-2 rocket sites. But it meant Patton's army was getting less fuel and ammunition than needed to sustain operations. Patton was furious. His tanks were literally running out of gas within sight of objectives. His units were capturing German supply dumps just to get enough fuel to continue. On August 30, Third Army headquarters reported that gasoline supplies were critically low. so low that operations would have to cease within days unless massive resupply occurred. The situation seemed impossible. How do you deliver millions of gallons of fuel and thousands of tons of supplies across hundreds of miles of war-damaged roads with insufficient trucks and exhausted drivers? The answer was the Red Ball Express, a solution so ambitious that it seemed crazy, but it worked.
On August 25, 1944, the Red Ball Express officially began operations. It would run until November 16, 1944, 83 days of continuous around-the-clock supply convoy operations. The concept was simple but revolutionary. Dedicate specific routes exclusively to supply trucks. Clear everything else off those roads. Have trucks run continuously in convoys, day and night. Push every truck and driver to maximum capacity. Ignore normal safety regulations and speed limits. Get supplies to the front at all costs. The name Red Ball came from railroad terminology. A red ball on a train indicated a fast, high-priority express shipment that had right-of-way over everything else. The Red Ball Express would operate the same way on highways. The system worked like this. The routes. 2 parallel one-way roads were designated, one for trucks heading toward the front, one for trucks returning to supply depots. The routes ran from Saint-Lô in Normandy to Chartres, then extended as the front moved. Eventually, routes stretched over 700 miles round trip. The trucks. The backbone was the GMC CCKW 2.5-ton 6x6 truck, the famous Jimmy or Deuce and a Half. These trucks were workhorses, reliable, capable of carrying 5 tons, double their rated capacity when overloaded, able to handle rough terrain. At peak, the Red Ball Express operated over 6,000 trucks simultaneously. The drivers. This is where the story gets both inspiring and troubling. About 75% of Red Ball Express drivers were Black Americans serving in segregated transportation corps units. These men drove in 18 to 20-hour shifts, sometimes longer. They drove through blackout conditions at night. They drove while exhausted. They drove knowing that German aircraft or ground forces might attack their convoys. The operations. Trucks ran in convoys for security and efficiency. They were supposed to maintain 60-yard spacing and 25 miles per hour speed. In practice, drivers often exceeded these limits. Some convoys ran at 40 to 50 miles per hour, and spacing collapsed as drivers tried to keep up. The roads were marked with Red Bull signs indicating the route. Military police controlled intersections, giving Red Bull convoys absolute priority. Everything else, civilian traffic, non-Red Bull military vehicles, even general staff cars, had to yield. The numbers. Over 83 days of operation, the Red Ball Express delivered approximately 412,000 tons of supplies. That's roughly 400,000 gallons of fuel daily, plus ammunition, rations, spare parts, and other materiel. At peak efficiency, over 6,000 trucks were moving supplies. The cost? The Red Ball Express consumed enormous resources. Trucks broke down constantly from overuse. Tire wear was catastrophic. The system consumed tires faster than they could be replaced. Accidents were frequent. Exhausted drivers running at high speed and blackout conditions inevitably crashed. Some drivers died in accidents. Others were killed by German air attacks or artillery.
The story of the Red Ball Express can't be told without understanding what it was like for the men who drove those trucks day and night across war-torn France. The segregation reality. This is an uncomfortable truth that must be confronted. The Red Ball Express was staffed overwhelmingly by Black American soldiers serving in segregated units. In 1944, the U.S. military was officially segregated by race. Black soldiers were generally relegated to support roles, quartermaster units, transportation units, engineering units. They were considered by racist military leadership to be unsuitable for combat roles. The irony is brutal. These men were trusted to keep the entire Allied advance supplied, but they weren't allowed to eat in the same mess holes as white soldiers or sleep in the same barracks. They were delivering supplies that would help win the war, but they'd return to an America where they faced discrimination and violence. Many Red Ball Express drivers saw the contradiction clearly. They were driving through a France that had been liberated from Nazi racial ideology, delivering supplies to fight against fascism, while serving in a segregated military. Some French civilians treated them with more respect and equality than their own army did. The driving conditions. The work was brutally difficult. Drivers would load up at supply dumps in Normandy and then drive for 10 to 20 hours straight to reach the front. The trucks were overloaded, making them handle poorly. The roads were damaged from combat, potholes, bomb craters, debris. Bridges had been destroyed and replaced by temporary Bailey bridges that could barely handle the weight of loaded trucks. Night driving was done under blackout conditions. No headlights, following the taillights of the truck ahead, which was supposed to be covered except for a tiny slit. Drivers navigated by memory, by feel, by instinct. Many learned their routes so well they could drive them in complete darkness. The pace was relentless. Drivers would arrive at the front, unload, then immediately turn around and drive back to reload. Some drivers reported doing 3 or 4 round trips per week with almost no sleep between runs. They'd sleep while their trucks were being loaded or unloaded, grab a quick meal, and then get back on the road. Maintenance was performed while trucks were moving. Convoys included mechanics who would ride along and repair vehicles on the move when possible. Trucks that broke down beyond field repair were pushed to the side of the road and replaced by spare vehicles. The dangers were already there. The roads were dangerous even without enemy action. Accidents were frequent, exhausted drivers losing control, vehicles running off the road, head-on collisions. Some drivers died in crashes, others were seriously injured. German aircraft occasionally strafed Red Ball convoys, though Allied air superiority made this increasingly rare by late 1944. More dangerous was encountering German stragglers or bypassed units. The pride. Despite the hardships and the segregation, many Red Ball Express drivers took fierce pride in their work. They knew they were essential. They knew that Patton's tanks moved because they delivered the fuel. They knew that every ton of supplies they delivered helped defeat Nazi Germany. One driver recalled, "We knew we were doing something important. Those white generals might not respect us, but they needed us. Without Red Ball, Patton doesn't move. Without Patton moving, the war takes longer. We were winning the war one truckload at a time." German intelligence gradually realized what was happening, and their assessment of American logistics shifted from mockery to grudging respect to something approaching awe. Initial German reports described the Red Ball Express as typical American excess, using thousands of trucks to deliver supplies that a more efficient army could deliver with hundreds. But as Patton's advance resumed and even accelerated, German commanders began to reconsider. Intelligence reports noted the scale of the operation. The Americans have organized a continuous motor transport system of unprecedented scope. Convoys of hundreds of trucks operate day and night, delivering supplies to forward areas faster than our forces can interdict them. This explains how enemy armored units continue operations despite our estimates that they should have exhausted their fuel supplies. Some German commanders proposed attacking the supply routes, but this proved difficult. Allied air superiority meant German aircraft couldn't safely attack convoys in daylight. Artillery could shell road junctions but couldn't stop the flow of trucks. German ground forces were too busy retreating or defending to spare units to raid supply lines deep in Allied-controlled territory. By September 1944, German operational planning had to account for American logistical capacity as a decisive factor. One German Army Group commander wrote, "The enemy's ability to supply forces over hundreds of kilometers, maintaining offensive operations at high tempo, exceeds anything in our military experience. Our doctrine assumed that enemy offensives would culminate when supply lines became overextended. The Americans have demonstrated that, with sufficient resources and organization, traditional limitations do not apply." This was a profound shift. The Germans had entered the war believing their tactical and operational superiority could overcome Allied material advantages. By late 1944, they were recognizing that American logistics, the very thing they'd mocked, was itself a war-winning capability. The Red Ball Express was more than just a truck convoy. It represented a fundamental principle of American military power: overwhelming logistics as a weapon system. Industrial war was, fundamentally, an industrial war. Victory went to nations that could produce more weapons, supply more troops, and sustain operations longer than their enemies. Germany and Japan had tactical and operational skill, but they lacked the industrial capacity to match American production. The Red Ball Express exemplified this. America could build tens of thousands of trucks, train thousands of drivers, consume hundreds of thousands of gallons of fuel in logistics alone, and still maintain offensive operations. This kind of material abundance was something Axis powers couldn't match or counter. Logistics as strategy. Traditional military thinking treated logistics as a support function, necessary but subordinate to tactical and operational concerns. American doctrine elevated logistics to a strategic priority. The question wasn't, how do we operate within our logistical constraints, but how do we expand our logistical capability to enable the operations we want to conduct? This approach required resources that only America possessed: enormous industrial production, massive transportation infrastructure, advanced organizational capability, and a cultural willingness to solve problems by throwing resources at them. The race question. The Red Ball Express also highlighted the contradiction at the heart of American society in 1944. The United States was fighting against Nazi racial ideology while maintaining its own system of racial segregation. Black soldiers driving for Red Ball Express were proving their capability, courage, and patriotism every day. They were essential to Allied victory. Yet they returned to an America where they faced discrimination, violence, and denial of basic rights. Many historians argue that World War II, and specifically the contributions of black service members, helped catalyze the civil rights movement. Men who'd driven across France, served their country, and helped defeat fascism, came home unwilling to accept second-class citizenship. The Red Ball Express was part of that story. Post-war influence. The lessons of the Red Ball Express influenced American military logistics forever. The emphasis on truck-based supply, the willingness to dedicate enormous resources to logistics, the understanding that supply lines could be a decisive weapon, all of these became foundational to American military doctrine. In every subsequent American war, Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf Wars, Afghanistan, Iraq, the same principle applied. American forces would have logistical superiority that enemies couldn't match. The Red Ball Express established the template. The Red Ball Express officially ended operations on November 16, 1944. By then, the port of Antwerp had finally been cleared and opened, providing a supply point much closer to the front lines. Rail lines had been repaired, providing more efficient bulk transportation. The emergency that had necessitated the Red Ball Express had passed. In 83 days of operation, the system had delivered over 412,000 tons of supplies. It had consumed an enormous amount of resources: trucks, fuel, tires, spare parts, and the physical and mental health of the drivers. But it had achieved its mission, keeping Patton's Third Army and other Allied forces supplied during the critical period when they were exploiting the Normandy breakout. The drivers returned to their regular transportation corps units. Many continued serving in logistics roles through the end of the war. Some transferred to combat units after the Army belatedly began integrating its forces in late 1944. They'd proven their capability beyond any doubt. After the war, veterans of the Red Ball Express faced the same challenges as other black veterans returning to a segregated America. Some became active in the civil rights movement, using their military service as evidence that they deserved full equality. The Red Ball Express Veterans Association formed to preserve the memory of their service and to fight for recognition. For decades, the Red Ball Express was largely forgotten by the broader public, though it was studied extensively by military logistics planners. It wasn't until the 1980s and 1990s that popular historians began telling the story to wider audiences. Today, the Red Ball Express is recognized as one of World War II's most significant logistical achievements. Memorials and historical markers have been erected along the routes in France. Veterans, now nearly all gone, were honored in their later years for their service. August 1944. German generals, studying maps, seeing Patton's advance slow as fuel runs low, begin to smile. American logistics, stretched too far, are failing. The advance will stop. Their assessment of American vulnerability seems vindicated. Then they see the intelligence reports about truck convoys. Thousands of trucks running day and night, delivering hundreds of thousands of gallons of fuel daily. The American advance, which should have stalled, resumes at full speed. The German generals stop smiling. This shouldn't be possible. No army in history has sustained operations like this. The logistical calculations don't work. Yet somehow the Americans are doing it anyway. This is the story the Red Ball Express tells. American power wasn't just about better tanks or more aircraft. It was about the ability to deliver overwhelming material support to the front lines, continuously, regardless of obstacles. 6,000 trucks, 23,000 drivers, most of them black Americans, serving in a segregated military, proving their capability and patriotism with every mile driven. 83 days of continuous operation, 412,000 tons of supplies delivered. Patton's Third Army kept moving when German generals predicted it would stop. The German generals had laughed at American logistics, seeing dependence on vast supply systems as a weakness. They learned too late that American logistics weren't a weakness. They were a weapon. A weapon that Germany, with its strained resources and disrupted infrastructure, had no counter for. The Red Ball Express didn't win the war by itself, but it enabled the forces that did. Every Sherman tank that rolled across France ran on fuel delivered by Red Ball drivers. Every artillery barrage fired shells transported by Red Ball trucks. Every American soldier ate rations hauled by Red Ball convoys. The men who drove those trucks, exhausted, working under dangerous conditions, serving in a segregated military that didn't give them the respect they deserved, kept the Allied advance moving at the critical moment. They proved that logistics could be decisive. They proved that American organizational capability and material abundance could overcome traditional military constraints. And they proved that Black Americans could serve with distinction in any role, under any conditions, contributing just as much to victory as anyone else. The German generals stopped laughing. They'd learned that American logistics weren't something to mock. They were something to fear.